In this video, we're going to learn how to reconcile refunds for purchases, coding multi-lined transactions, adding files to transactions, and how to change the tax treatment on an individual transaction. Let's first look at how to deal with refunds for purchases. When you receive a refund for something, you need to code it to the same chart of account code you used initially. So if we have a look at this example here, we spent $250 at Placemakers for some repairs and maintenance. And then we returned the goods because they were faulty, so we received a cash refund. So the initial transaction, because it was repairs and maintenance, is going to be coded to the repairs and maintenance code. And by the same logic, we're going to code the refund to repairs and maintenance. Which basically cancels out the initial purchase. Now we're going to learn how to change the tax treatment on an individual transaction. If we have a look at this example here, we have paid a contractor their fee. However, looking at their invoice, they are not GST registered. I want to use the subcontractor's code I have set up in Xero. But this defaults to 15% GST on expenses. So how do I correctly code this transaction? Well, I still use the subcontractor's account code, but here in this little drop down, I select the No GST option and then click OK. So if you need to change the tax treatment of the transaction because the supplier is not GST registered, click this arrow and select the correct GST treatment and then reconcile the transaction. I just also want to point out here, if you have tracking categories set up and need to code the transaction to a tracking category and option, you can do so via the drop-down here. Sometimes, when coding the transaction, it needs to be put to several codes using different line items. To do that, we use the Add Details feature to open up the transaction and add different line items. For example, if we see this statement line here, we have been to the supermarket to buy some office supplies and also some alcohol. So we need to use different codes for these items. So looking at the receipt, $25 was spent on alcohol, $15 was cleaning products, and $10 was general expenses. So we click Add Details to open up the transaction, and we start off by putting alcohol in the description, 1 at $25, and coded to entertainment. And here we can code the line to a tracking category if needed. We've spent $15 on cleaning products. So on our next line item we put cleaning products. 1, $15, and code it to the cleaning code. And then the third line item is for tea and coffee. $10, coded to general expenses. You'll also see here the file icon which we saw in the Sales Invoice 101 course. Here, we can upload the receipt for the transaction to help with our record keeping. It is good to have the receipt or invoice for purchases stored on each transaction, so they can easily be found for auditing purposes and also as a reference for other Xero users, such as your accountant. So to attach the receipt, I click the file icon, click Upload, find the receipt, and there it is. Attaching receipts and invoices can really help reduce the amount of time your accountant spends checking your coding, as they don't need to ask you questions when they can see the evidence for themselves. Then we press Save Transaction and then Reconcile. So, if you need to add multiple line items to the transaction, you use the Add Details link to open up the transaction and fill in the lines. You also use the Add Details link to upload copies of receipts and invoices to the transaction. Just note that you should keep copies of invoices and receipts in another place as well as in your Xero, for example, Dropbox or an external hard drive. Also note that FPOS dockets do not count as receipts, so make sure you ask for a GST receipt when you make a purchase. To round up, we looked at how to code the transaction for a refund on a purchase. We then looked at how to change the GST treatment on an individual transaction. And finally, we looked at using the Add Details link to open up the transaction to add multiple line details and coding, along with attaching documents to transactions, which can be very useful for record keeping and reference purposes. Now let's test your knowledge with a quick quiz.